Today, we are taking a walk down memory lane and reviewing the Game 7 episode that covers the epic battle between the Rangers and the Canucks, including some never-before-heard stories from behind the scenes.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1177 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets. If you win your first $5 bet, visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, been talking about doing this episode for some time. Not too long ago, Amazon Prime released, I guess what we could call a mini-series. It's called Game 7. There are 5 episodes. They focus on historic Game 7s throughout sports history, baseball, hockey, and basketball. And one of the 5 episodes that they choose to hone in on was Game 7 between the Rangers and Canucks, of course, in the 1994 Stanley Cup Final. A game and a moment in time that's obviously very near and dear to a lot of us as New York Ranger fans. And I figure we could take an episode, do something a little lighter, something kind of fun here today. And basically, I'll just share my thoughts on the documentary. I'll talk about a couple of stories that I had not heard before. It really is crazy. You think you've heard it all and you've seen it all and you've read all these books and you've seen all these articles and watch all these different documentaries on the 1994 New York Rangers. You've heard the players talk about it in various interviews, but there's always a new story, at least for me, that I haven't heard before, and there were a couple of them in here as well. I thought it was just a very well-done documentary, some very interesting action shots. Like, I'll give you a quick example here before we dive into the details, but, that save that Mike Richter made on Pavel Bure in Game 4 on the penalty shot, the famous save that he made there to keep the Rangers, or to keep them down by just a goal at that point in the game. It was 2-1 in favor of the Canucks. Of course, the Rangers ended up coming back to win. But they showed some angles of that penalty shot that I had never seen before, and I thought that was really cool. They did that a couple of times in this documentary. They must have, in one way or another, gotten their hands on some footage that, is not common to see as it pertains to this series, and specifically the Game 7. But yeah, basically, like I said, just going to go through the entire documentary here and kind of share my thoughts along the way. So the first thing I noticed before I even hit play, you've got the episode descriptions, again, for all 5 of these episodes, and of course the one focuses on the Rangers and the Canucks. The episode description says that Mark Messier risked his legacy after winning 5 cups in Edmonton to come to the Rangers. I got to disagree with that. The guy won 5 Stanley Cups. He's a slam dunk Hall of Famer, one of the absolute best to ever lace up a pair of skates. Now, did his career resume and did his legacy improve after what he did with the Rangers, being a phenomenal captain for this team and, of course, breaking the curse and coming through with all these clutch moments in that Stanley Cup playoff run? Yes, but even if it had failed, even if the Rangers never won a Stanley Cup under Mark Messier, I don't think people would have looked back on him and thought, yeah, you know what, that guy wasn't very good. Yeah, you know what, he still had the same 5 Stanley Cups and obviously all the numbers and accolades that he piled up through his career. So I think Mark Messier would have been just fine even if things didn't work out there. Obviously, I'm happy that they did work out in New York and that he did lead this team to the Stanley Cup, but I think Mark Messier would have been okay in the grand scheme of things. There were a lot of interesting highlights that honestly kind of felt a little bit out of place in this documentary, but I nevertheless enjoyed them because they focused in for a little while on highlights of Messier and Wayne Gretzky in Edmonton and the dynamic there. They actually covered the trade of Wayne Gretzky to the Kings, which, again, you've got a Game 7 here in 1994 between the Rangers and the Canucks, and you're spending this time focusing on the Oilers and the trade of Gretzky. It was a little strange, but I will say that I found it interesting nevertheless because, my knowledge of those, the Oilers teams that won the Stanley Cup so many times is kind of limited. I mean, I know the Cliff Notes. I know all the players that were there, all the Hall of Famers they had, what an unbelievable team that was. And of course, so many of those players on the Edmonton Oilers ended up playing on the Rangers for their 1994 Stanley Cup run. So I know the Cliff Notes, but it kind of made me realize that I'd like to learn a little bit more about those teams and, what those Ranger players did while they were members of the Oilers during that dynasty there. But the documentary continues. They kind of gloss over the Devils series a little bit. They do show, obviously, the Stefan Matteau goal. I was fine with them mostly skipping the series against the Devils. They went back to it a little bit later in the documentary to give you some more details, but I was fine with it because, again, this is called Game 7, and it's supposed to focus in on, Rangers versus Canucks, which it mostly did. But, I did find it interesting to hear the Rangers that were interviewed for this documentary, all building up to Game 7. They talk about Game 5 and Game 6 and how the Rangers kind of lost their edge in those two games. They were trying to force things a little bit. And when you watch highlights from those games or even watch them in their entirety, you can kind of see that. The documentary then also showed clips from Messier's first 2 years in New York and just all the insanity that they went through. So the documentary spent some time kind of building toward this Game 7 and what the storyline was going into it and just giving you all the history and the facts heading into that Game 7. But, they talk about the Rangers missing the playoffs the year before they won the Stanley Cup. They talk about the team hiring Mike Keenan and what a roll of the dice that was. Keenan had success, but to say he was a loose cannon was probably putting it mildly. And Keenan was interviewed for this documentary, and he said, "My coaching style is about your ability to respond to tough situations quickly." That's very concise and very basic, but there's a lot under the surface there that, you can multiply that times 10. That is what I would imagine it was like to play hockey for Mike Keenan. Keenan also told a story. This is one of those stories that I had never heard before, that I talked about earlier. Told a story, and maybe some of you had heard this story, but I had not. Mike Keenan told the story about how he showed the members of the Rangers, before the season even starts, he shows them a video of the Mets victory parade in 1986 after they had won the World Series. Because in Keenan's words, there was no footage from the Rangers winning the Stanley Cup and having a parade. So that, I think, really kind of strikes the right tone with your new players. And Messier said that he loved when Mike Keenan did this because, you have to be able to envision it. And I think just even the very simple fact that this has never been done. We don't even have any footage of the Rangers having any kind of a victory parade after winning the Stanley Cup. So we got to show you it from a different sport. But I think that also kind of gives these players the idea that, we have a chance to do this. And obviously we'll be a special group. And you fast forward all these years and we're still talking about the 1994 Rangers and just the epic path that they took to winning the Stanley Cup. So I love that he did that. I like to think that those kind of tactics are still being used as far as, motivating players and whatnot. But just great stuff there. Letting them see it and letting them envision it before they, began the quest to winning the Stanley Cup. They also talked about, I found this interesting, the Game 4 between the Rangers and the Devils. Now, at this point, Rangers are up 2-1 in the Eastern Conference Finals, so they're mostly in good shape. I believe they won Game 3 in overtime because Matteau had 2 overtime winners in that series. Obviously, the one that we all think of is Game 7, but I think it was Game 3 that he won in overtime. But Game 4 happens. The Rangers don't play very well, and Keenan benches Leach. He pulls Richter out of the game. I believe Messier lost some ice time as well. And this is another story that I had never heard before, or if I did, I kind of forgot about it. But apparently after this game, at practice the next day, Messier had a talk with Mike Keenan about this tactic, and he told him basically that, what you did in that game, it's not motivating, it's not inspiring, it's not what we need right now. Messier told Keenan that he needs to apologize to the team and say that it was a mistake and that they're the best team in hockey. And per Messier, in this documentary, that's exactly what Mike Keenan did. It's very hard for me to picture in my head Mike Keenan apologizing for anything, but apparently that's what happened if you go by what Mark Messier said in this documentary. And I've talked about this before too. Look, Mike Keenan, obviously he's a tough guy. He's a disciplinarian, and it's his way or the highway. And so for me, looking at this situation in Game 4 against the Devils, it's not the time to do this. That's always been my takeaway from, him benching Leach and pulling Richter and benching Messier. If it's January and you feel like you need to send a message to your team and you're going to bench the star defenseman and bench the captain and pull the goalie out of the game, then by all means do it. You got to do what you got to do. But Game 4 of the Eastern Conference Final against the Devils, when you have a chance to take a 3-1 series lead, that is not the time to do something like this. And obviously, it sounds like Mike Keenan can at least acknowledge that it was a mistake. Fortunately, the Rangers, after falling behind 3-2, we all know what happened next. The Messier guarantee and the natural hat trick in Game 6. And then, of course, Stefan Matteau in Game 7. It was kind of funny, though, because Messier, the famous guarantee for the Game 6 win, he said in this documentary that he only wanted the 20 Rangers to read the paper and not all of New York. And I laughed when I heard that because I'm thinking like, Mess, that's not how it works, man. Like when you say something like that to the media, it's going to get splashed everywhere. I can't even imagine what this would be like today with social media and whatnot. I mean, word traveled relatively quickly back then, but I mean, today, seconds after he said it, it would be all over the internet and people would be having a field day with it. So interesting story there as well. I also thought it was interesting to hear some perspective from the other side because obviously, you know, the Rangers played the Canucks in this Game 7 here, and they got Trevor Linden. He wasn't like in person or anything. It sounds like they interviewed him over the phone, but Trevor Linden, the former Canucks captain, he was able to be interviewed for this. And I give him props for participating because I think at best it's probably a bittersweet memory for him. So interesting to hear some of his quotes, and we'll get into those a little bit later in the episode. And then just seeing all these clips from outside Madison Square Garden before Game 7 and just how frenzied it was. And I mean, everybody's ready to go, but there's that nervousness and that anxiety that's in the air as well. It really just puts you right back in that time period. I thought this documentary did an excellent job with that. It was just fun to go back and kind of re-experience the whole thing all over again, you know, kind of feel what the fans were feeling and see what they were seeing and whatnot. So good stuff there. In just a second, we're going to shift our attention to the game itself, Game 7, and how this documentary covered it, as well as some other never-before-heard stories from this team and this run to the Stanley Cup in 1994 for the Rangers. And we will do all that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you do not have to waste time searching through thousands and thousands of tickets. Right now, Gametime is having an exclusive zone deal for the NHL Winter Classic event at Wrigley Field. Go to the Gametime app to purchase tickets and get 10% off bleacher seating and 20 to 25% off on home plate area seats. Curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. You've got all-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows you the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. Seat views get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, and the lowest price guarantee or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime Picks. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It is game time. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is also brought to you by FanDuel, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. Once again, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment mean more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Big shout out to the everydayers as always. In our next episode, going to go ahead and break down everything that happens between the Rangers and the Sabres. The Rangers play host to the Buffalo Sabres on Thursday at 7 o'clock. We'll discuss that game in the next episode. But for right now, want to continue our focus on this game, this documentary of Game 7 between the Rangers and the Canucks. And I got to say, this documentary, I feel like as much or more than any other documentary that we've seen on the 1994 Rangers, this one does an exceptionally awesome job of just really putting you on the ice, really kind of putting you in the moment, kind of shooting this and giving you the kind of footage the kind of camera angles that really make you feel like you're right down on the ice with those players. You know, you hear the noise of the crowd and everything, and the sounds of hockey, you know, the puck hitting the boards and players, you know, checking each other and whatnot, all the talking that goes on during the course of a hockey game between the players, the opponents, the teammates, the refs, whatever it might be. You really feel like you're right down there on the ice. That's why I really recommend, one of many reasons why I really recommend this documentary. But then the game starts and, you know, all the buildup is over and they show everything. And, you know, early parts of this game, you get a couple saves by Richter, a couple of big hits each way. I still get tense watching this. Like, it's a game that happened more than 30 years ago, and there's that little part of me that's like still a little nervous watching it, even though I obviously know what happened. But they highlighted a play in this game that you don't see highlighted very often. This happened in the first period when the Rangers were up 1-0. Glenn Anderson is along the boards, actually right along the Ranger bench, and he's down on one knee, and then he takes a stick to the face, and nothing gets called. Everybody in Madison Square Garden saw this high stick except for the official. Even now, I get like mad like watching this and seeing them miss a blatant call there. There should have been a penalty against the Canucks, but you got Mike Keenan yelling at the referee because of course you do. Steve Larmer stands up on the bench and screams, F you at the referee, just politely disagreeing with the non-call there. Keenan was yelling that it was an elbow and this, that, and the other thing, but, Anderson was down. I think he was bleeding a little bit. Not even sure he missed a shift after that because, again, hockey players, that's typically the way that it goes, especially in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. But, then the Rangers get a power play. They're still up 1-0 at this point, and you hear somebody on the bench. I couldn't tell who said it, but somebody on the bench says, guys, we need to get that next bleeping goal, and they did exactly that. Adam Graves delivers on the power play, and the Rangers go up 2-0. But then they also talked about how they knew what they were up against. They knew the Canucks were a tough opponent. They knew there would eventually be some pushback. Trevor Linden, as I mentioned a minute ago, was interviewed for this, and he was talking in the interview about how it only takes 1 second to turn things around. You just need that spark. And then, of course, Linden himself, while the Canucks were shorthanded, goes in on a breakaway and scores against Richter to make it 2-1. And Linden said, we had been in that situation before. This was not over yet. And isn't that the truth? I mean, it's one of those things where there were times in this game where it felt like the Rangers maybe could take over and really just run away with it. But, I mean, even as Ranger fans or even just as hockey fans, we all know better. We know that's not the way that it typically goes. And with that being the case, I mean, the Rangers weren't going to make this easy. The Rangers weren't going to just go out and win this game 5-0. This is the New York Rangers that we're talking about, and we knew this was going to be a nail-biter right down to the final whistle and the final horn. But Messier was talking about this, the Canucks coming back and getting their push, and he said, everyone could feel it. It's slipping away again. Are the demons that bleeping strong? All these things are going through your mind. You don't just win the Stanley Cup because it's your turn. And that's an impactful quote there as well. It's because there's times, ever since then, even before then, I'm sure, where it feels like it's the Rangers' year, but you don't win the Stanley Cup just because it's your turn. That trophy is earned in a major way every single season. And obviously 1994 here was no exception. They do show the Messier goal that some believe should have gone to Brian Noonan, but either way, puck goes in the net and the Rangers are up 3-1. Then they show the third period. They took a little bit of a break from the game footage to show some present day footage. What they did throughout this documentary is they followed Mark Messier and Brian Leetch around a little bit. They were interviewed for this in person. They showed them getting in a cab to go to Madison Square Garden. We're talking about present day right now. They showed them walking through Madison Square Garden, walking through the tunnel that they had gone through, sitting in the rafters and looking at their jerseys, in the Madison Square Garden rafters there. But they showed the two of them walking into the Ranger locker room, and they see old pictures of themselves. It's really a cool moment. And Messier told Leetch that he should show the camera, the people making the documentary. He should show them where Keenan's office is, since Keenan called him in there so many times, and Brian Leetch would obviously remember. So that was pretty funny. They had a good laugh about that. They actually showed the lineup card from Game 7. Messier and Leetch were both looking at it, and Messier was talking about how it was an experienced and heavy team, and Messier said that he was surrounded by other great leaders who had won before in the past. And obviously, talking about some of those guys that he won those cups with in Edmonton. But yeah, the lineup card, that was crazy to see that. The forwards, the defensemen, the whole 9 yards. I don't think this is the actual lineup card from 30 years ago. I mean, the ink looked a little bit too fresh, and I don't think they would have that just lying around in there somewhere in Madison Square Garden in the locker room. So they probably just redid it, for the two of them being there that day. But it was still cool to look at. And Leetch was talking, again, this is present day, and he's talking about, the approach to the third period. And he said, obviously, we had to keep an eye on Bure, which, yes, they did, because by far the most talented player on that Canucks team. He also mentioned that Kirk McLean was playing well. And Leetch said in the locker room, during that second intermission, there was no yelling about one more period. They all knew they had to keep playing the same way, and there was kind of a calm to the whole thing. Messier mentioned that. They then show a clip of the Rangers going back onto the ice for Game 7. Obviously, the crowd is going absolutely insane. Rangers had a couple of chances to extend their lead. Vancouver obviously cuts it down to 3-2. And they have these great shots of all the fans in the stands. I mean, go back and watch, honestly, the entire game if you have the time. But if not, certainly this documentary. People are just on pins and needles. It's not atypical to what you would usually see in a Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. But when you watch this documentary, and it's something that I noticed even watching this game live when I was 7 years old and watching it back since then, there's a feeling in that arena that is very, very difficult to describe. It's obviously frenzied and people are obviously making a lot of noise, but it's just this complete gamut of emotions where people are nervous, they're uncomfortable, but they're also excited, they're ready to party. They're just completely captivated by everything that they're seeing on the ice. You're living and dying with every single shift. Just a very, very unique feel in that Madison Square Garden building that night. If the Rangers, I hate even saying this, but if the Rangers had lost that game, I just cannot even imagine what it would have been like when that ended. You would have heard nothing but the Canucks celebrating on the ice, and thank God that didn't happen. But yeah, I mean, they continue to talk about everything that happened there. You know, Keenan mentioned that it was a vicious game was the word that he used, and it really was. I mean, the hitting was just off the charts in this Game 7 here. And then they focused in on the Canucks hitting the post when they were down just 3-2 in the third period, which they did. It was a little bit the outside of the post, but this did not miss by going in the net by that much. And Messier, again, being interviewed in present day, he said, "I can't tell you how many times I've woken up in a cold sweat with that puck going in the net. I can see it so clearly. For 54 years, that goal did go in against the Rangers, but it didn't that night." And that's true as well. You know, obviously, look, the Rangers didn't win the Stanley Cup for 54 years. That's really on nobody but them. But it's not like they were exactly getting a ton of puck luck in the years building up to that final, that moment where they won in 1994. And a lot of you guys probably know what I'm talking about, you know, some of those seasons before 1994. But yeah, you know, you get down to 5 minutes and, you know, everybody's on pins and needles. The Canucks pull their goalie, and eventually the Rangers win it, and they've got Messier. This is another really iconic shot from that whole thing. First of all, the final face-off and Messier jumping up and down like he's 5 years old on Christmas morning. That was awesome. And then he's also got the Stanley Cup, and he's lifting it up to the glass and letting the fans touch it. That's always a cool shot as well. And interesting quote here from Trevor Linden. I said it was interesting to hear, you know, some of the thoughts from the opposition. This is what he had to say about the situation. And they showed Linden after Game 7 ended. He's down on one knee, just kind of like in disbelief, just kind of in a daze. That's what he had to say. "I remember kneeling on the side of the ice. It's a hard thing to get your head around. You played some of the hardest hockey, played through some of the most painful injuries, grinded your way through 2.5 months of the hardest hockey you've played, and you got nothing to show for it. Nobody remembers who finishes second. The hockey market in Vancouver loves that team, so it's devastating to hear what happened back in Vancouver." And that last sentence there, he's referring to the riots that happened after Game 7 in Vancouver. It's a quote that really hits you because it kind of makes me think, I mean, the Canucks losing, I mean, you know what, too bad. I certainly can empathize and everything, but it kind of takes me back to 2014 and that Rangers Stanley Cup team that made it to the finals but didn't win it. It's kind of the same deal there. We can all look back on that fondly. I hope if nothing else, you know, some of those players do have some good memories from that and they are proud of what they accomplished that season. But when you don't win the Stanley Cup at the end, I mean, it's bittersweet at best. I mean, that's an absolute gut punch way to end your season. And obviously we all went through that in 2014. We've gone through that to a lesser extent, you know, in 2 of the last 3 seasons when they've made it to the conference final but couldn't make it to the finals. But when you're right there, you're one of the last 2 team standings. You've grinded through all these playoff rounds. You've taken out 3 other playoff teams, and then you lose in the finals. Man, it doesn't get much tougher than that. So that one really hit me for sure, hearing that from Trevor Linden. Gonna keep everything rolling just a second. I want to have some final thoughts on this and kind of talk about the aftermath of, you know, what happened following this Game 7 here. So we will do all that fun stuff in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Indeed. We are driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate is not to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with quality candidates faster. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. All right, I figured we can go ahead and wrap up today's episode with some final thoughts on this Game 7 documentary, once again featuring the Rangers and the Canucks in 1994. Just an awesome memory for anybody that was around to have witnessed it. And if you're a younger Ranger fan, or if you're just now getting into hockey, can't recommend it enough. You can really find yourself going down a rabbit hole and just kind of watching one of these things after another, anything having to do with the 1994 New York Rangers. It's always a really nice memory to relive. And as I mentioned, this documentary did a great job. I thought its strongest aspect was just really putting you on the ice and making you feel the intensity and the energy of the moment, just how everything felt inside Madison Square Garden on that night. As I mentioned, I think they did a nice job interviewing a wide range of people as well. Obviously, Mark Messier and Brian Leetch kind of took center stage there. You know, they had them interviewed while taking their old taxi cab ride to Madison Square Garden. The two of them mentioned that they used to ride together on game day to Madison Square Garden in a taxi, and they talked about remembering that ride for Game 7. And they admitted they were both anxious, both a little bit apprehensive, both just basically wanting to get on the ice. They also mentioned the difference, and I found this interesting, the difference in Madison Square Garden between Game 5 and Game 7, as far as just the vibes from the fans. Because Game 5, you're up 3-1. You've won 3 games in a row, including the last 2 on the road in Vancouver. You're ready to end this thing. You're ready to party. It was more of a party atmosphere on that night. And then, of course, they don't get it done. They also lose Game 6. They come back for Game 7. And Messier and Leetch both talked about how you could feel the anxiety. You could feel the tension in the building. And again, you know, you go back and watch that games. There is a completely different energy, completely different vibe between Game 5 and Game 7 in Madison Square Garden. So I thought that was interesting to hear the two of them talk about this as well. And just seeing them, you know, go through all their old places that they used to go through on game day. You know, they did a nice job with this documentary. They show footage of Messier and Leetch walking through the tunnel in Game 7. And then they show right after that footage of the two of them walking through the tunnel during present day, you know, obviously as part of this documentary. But just really cool, you know, seeing them relive everything. And then the documentary ends, the final scene. This was really cool. They've got Messier and Leetch sitting in one of the skyboxes at the top of Madison Square Garden, sitting in the rafters. The two of them are sitting there not too far away from the area of the Madison Square Garden ceiling, the rafters there, where their jerseys currently reside. Obviously, they've long since had their numbers retired. And Messier says, "It never gets old. It doesn't even seem real." And this is a strong quote from Mark Messier near the end of this documentary here. He said, "We tackled the challenge in a way that really resonated with people. That was the essence of that championship in 1994. And then, of course, the documentary, they show a couple of clips from the parade, which, I mean, that's what it's all about, man. You see that parade of the Rangers, you know, going down through New York City on those floats, holding up the Stanley Cup, just absolutely packed. There's nowhere to go. You couldn't fit another soul into those streets there during that parade. That's how crowded it was. And, of course, people are in buildings watching it. Just an absolute party atmosphere. And yeah, like I said, that's what it's all about. That's what kind of, I think, makes us all fans. That's what keeps us coming back to this team. You know, we enjoy hockey on pretty much every level. I think if you're watching this, that's probably the case. And we obviously are big-time fans of the New York Rangers. But as much as we can enjoy, you know, a regular season game or an epic win here, or this player's on a heater or whatever it might be, the thing that I think really keeps us coming back is the idea of maybe getting to do this again, maybe getting to see this team win another Stanley Cup championship. I know that's what kind of motivates me and what really drives my fandom, you know, that moment where you do end up winning another Stanley Cup championship. But again, they close on this scene of Messier and Leetch in the rafters there, or in the skybox in Madison Square Garden. And Leetch wondered if they had lost Game 7, if it ever would have happened, if the Rangers would have ever won a Stanley Cup. Well, we know up to current day they have not won it again. And Messier said he can't even imagine losing that series. And that's what I said a little bit earlier in today's episode. I just cannot even imagine what that scene would have been like. Seeing the Canucks race onto the Garden ice and hearing Madison Square Garden just go completely silent, just seeing the looks on people's faces and filing to the exits. It's surreal to think about, and I honestly don't want to think about it too much. but you can't help but wonder, in some alternate universe, what that would have been like. But, Messier, again, he said that he can't even imagine what it would have been like losing that series. And Leach was quick to remind him, hey, you know what? You don't have to. And Messier said, thank goodness I can take a deep breath. And the documentary pretty much ended on that. But again, I can't recommend this enough. If you're just getting into the Rangers or you just want to relive an awesome memory, definitely take some time to go back and watch this. Like I said, it seems to be a mini series. There's 5 episodes available now on demand on Amazon Prime. The name of the series is Game 7. If you type that in, it'll certainly come up. There's another New York centric episode. It looks at 2003 Yankees versus Red Sox in the ALCS. That's probably going to be the next one that I watch, but I plan on watching all 5 of them. There's a couple that I don't really know a whole lot about. There's a basketball episode or two, and curious to, because I'm not the biggest basketball fan, but a documentary like that I would definitely check out. I'm definitely curious to see how it looks, and my only hope is that there ends up being more episodes of this. If it catches on, hopefully there are. Maybe someday we get another Game 7 episode that features the Rangers. You could certainly do one on Rangers Devils. That to me seems like something they wouldn't do right away because they just covered the 94 Rangers. But if this series really catches on and they produce a whole bunch more episodes, absolutely, I think that could be on the list somewhere down the road. Rangers Devils from 1994. And of course, Stefan Matteau in overtime. But yeah, I figure we can pretty much call it there for today. If you guys would like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well at LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's at LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.